Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, by Jon Meacham. Introduction. Imagine this. It's the dead of winter, February 1801. The brand new capital city, Washington, is little more than a muddy village, and it's paralyzed by a bitter snowstorm and an even more bitter political crisis. Inside a simple boarding house, just a few hundred paces from the half-finished Capitol building, a tall, sandy-haired Virginian waits. He's just won a brutal presidential election against the sitting president, John Adams. But there's a problem. A flaw in the Constitution has led to a tie, not with his opponent, but with his own running mate, Aaron Burr. The election is thrown to the House of Representatives, where his sworn political enemies will now decide his fate. Rumors are flying. Whispers of a military coup, of civil war. The very foundation of the young American Republic seems to be cracking. And at the center of it all is this man, Thomas Jefferson, trying to hold himself together while the nation he helped create threatens to tear itself apart. How does a person find themselves in a moment like that? What kind of life prepares you to face the potential collapse of your country? And more importantly, how do you develop the skills, the art, not just to survive it, but to win, and to usher in an era that will forever bear your name? That's the incredible story we're diving into today, through the eyes of Pulitzer Prize-winning author Jon Meacham in his masterpiece, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. This isn't just a biography, it's a deep exploration of leadership, ambition, and the messy human reality of how power is won, wielded, and kept. By the end of our time together, you'll understand the secret to Jefferson's success. He was a dreamer who mastered the real world. He was a philosopher who was also a fighter. And in his story, we find timeless lessons about how to turn grand visions into lasting realities. Book summary. To understand the man who would face down that crisis in 1801, we have to go back. Back to the wild frontier of Virginia, long before the Revolution was even a whisper. Jefferson's story begins not with philosophy, but with raw, physical strength. His father, Peter Jefferson, was a legend in the Virginia wilderness. A self-made man, a surveyor and mapmaker, Peter was known for his incredible endurance and power. There were stories of him single-handedly pulling down buildings that 3 enslaved men couldn't budge. He was a man who could impose his will on the rugged landscape, and he taught his son that to lead, you had to be strong, in body and in mind. But there was another side to Jefferson's inheritance. His mother, Jane Randolph, came from one of the most powerful and aristocratic families in Virginia. Through her, Jefferson was connected to a world of privilege, refinement, and influence. So from his very first breath, Thomas Jefferson lived with a contradiction. He was the son of the frontier and the son of the plantation elite. He was a product of self-made grit and inherited power. This duality, this tension between the ideal of the common man and the reality of the aristocrat, would define his entire life. His education was his true forge. He was sent to the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, the bustling capital of colonial Virginia. And there, his world exploded. He fell in with a remarkable group of mentors. There was the brilliant scientist William Small, who opened his mind to the Enlightenment, teaching him that reason, not tradition, should be the guide for human affairs. Then there was George Wythe, the greatest lawyer in Virginia, who took Jefferson under his wing for 5 years, shaping him into a precise and powerful thinker. And finally, there was the royal governor himself, Francis Fauquier. Jefferson became a regular at the governor's palace, invited to intimate dinners where he, a mere student, would talk philosophy, science, and politics with the most powerful men in the colony. He'd play his violin in the evenings, soaking in the atmosphere of elegance and authority. This was his masterclass. He wasn't just learning about power, he was living alongside it, observing it, and developing a taste for it. But for all his intellectual brilliance, Jefferson had one great weakness. He was a terrible public speaker. He hated confrontation. His voice was weak, and he froze in front of crowds. Early on, he had a crush on a young woman named Rebecca Burwell. He planned to make a grand, eloquent declaration of his love at a dance. He rehearsed his lines, dressed himself up, and when the moment came, he stammered. He choked. He could barely get a few broken sentences out. He was humiliated. It was a painful but crucial lesson. Jefferson realized his power wouldn't come from the thunder of his voice, but from the quiet force of his pen. He learned that he could move men and shape events far more effectively through writing than he ever could through oratory. This discovery would change the course of his life, and the course of a nation. The world was changing too. Britain, deep in debt from its wars, began to tighten its grip on the American colonies. Taxes like the Stamp Act weren't just about money, they were about control. And in Williamsburg, the young lawyer Thomas Jefferson had a front-row seat to the unfolding drama. He stood in the doorway of the House of Burgesses and watched a fiery, rough-around-the-edges orator named Patrick Henry deliver a speech that shook the colonies. Tarquin and Caesar had their Brutus, Henry thundered, comparing King George to tyrants of old, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III. He paused, and the chamber erupted. "Treason!" shouted the speaker. Jefferson was electrified. He said Henry spoke as Homer wrote. In that moment, the abstract ideas of liberty he'd been reading about became real, urgent, and dangerous. But he also learned a deeper political lesson. The next day, after Henry had left town, the more cautious establishment figures in the House skillfully maneuvered to rescind Henry's most radical resolutions. Jefferson watched, fascinated. He saw that passion and eloquence were powerful, but they weren't enough. To truly win, you needed strategy, patience, and a mastery of the rules of the game. You had to know when to push, when to compromise, and how to outwit your opponents. It was a lesson in the art of power that he never forgot. As tensions with Britain escalated, Jefferson honed his greatest weapon. In 1774, he wrote a powerful pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British America. It was bold, eloquent, and radical. It made him famous. It also put him on London's radar as a dangerous man. Then came 1776. The colonies were at war. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress was debating the ultimate step, independence. They needed a document, a declaration to the world explaining why. They formed a committee, but who should write it? John Adams, the fiery patriot from Massachusetts, knew it shouldn't be him. He was too abrasive, too unpopular. He turned to the quiet, 33-year-old Virginian. "Why me?" Jefferson asked. Adams gave him 3 reasons. First, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. And the third reason? You can write 10 times better than I can. So, in a rented room in Philadelphia, Jefferson sat down to write. He wasn't trying to invent new ideas. His goal, he said, was to create an expression of the American mind. He drew on the philosophy of John Locke and the ideas of the Enlightenment he had studied with his mentors, and he distilled them into something simple, powerful, and timeless. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With those words, he gave a new nation its creed. But even this masterpiece was a product of political compromise. His original draft included a powerful condemnation of the slave trade, blaming King George for forcing slavery onto the colonies. But the delegates from the South wouldn't have it. To keep the fragile Union together, the passage was cut. Jefferson was pained by the edit, sitting silently as his colleagues picked apart his words. It was another hard lesson in the gap between the ideal and the real. The high of 1776 was quickly followed by the lowest point of Jefferson's public career. He was elected governor of Virginia in the middle of the war, just as the British decided to invade. The state was unprepared. The government had little money and a weak militia. Jefferson, a man who preferred his library to the battlefield, was overwhelmed. In 1781, British forces under the command of the traitor Benedict Arnold swept through Virginia. Jefferson and the state legislature were forced to flee Richmond. The British cavalry, led by the ruthless Banastre Tarleton, even raided Monticello itself. Jefferson famously escaped just minutes before they arrived, a flight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His enemies would forever label him a coward who had abandoned his post. The Virginia legislature launched an inquiry into his conduct. Though he was eventually cleared, the experience wounded him deeply. He wrote that the accusation had inflicted a wound on my spirit which will only be cured by the all-healing grave. This public failure was compounded by an unbearable private tragedy. His wife, Martha, whom he adored, had been weakened by 6 pregnancies in 10 years. Her health failed. For 4 long months in 1782, Jefferson never left her side. He was her constant nurse, sitting by her bed, reading to her, holding her hand. As she lay dying, she made him promise that he would never remarry, that he would never place her children under the care of a stepmother. He gave his word. When she died, Jefferson collapsed. He fainted and remained insensible for so long that his family feared he too would die. For 3 weeks, he locked himself in his room, pacing endlessly, a solitary figure consumed by grief. When he finally emerged, he would mount his horse and ride for hours through the woods, with his young daughter Patsy as his only companion, a silent witness to his bursts of sorrow. He felt his world had ended. But a new one was about to begin. Looking for an escape from his grief, Jefferson accepted a post he had previously turned down. He would go to France as an American minister. Paris was a revelation. It was the glittering center of the Enlightenment, a world of art, science, architecture, and revolutionary ideas. For 5 years, he soaked it all in. He negotiated treaties, sent back new plans and technologies for America, and engaged with the greatest minds of the age. He was a man of the world now, but he was also a man torn. This was brilliantly captured in a famous letter he wrote after a whirlwind romance with a beautiful, married Anglo-Italian artist named Maria Cosway. The affair was passionate and intense, and when she left Paris, he was heartbroken. He wrote her a long, strange, wonderful letter, framed as a dialogue between my head and my heart. His head is the voice of cold, calculating reason. The art of life is the art of avoiding pain. The head scolds. Do not bite at the bait of pleasure till you know there is no hook beneath it. It tells him he was foolish to invest so much emotion in someone he was bound to lose. But his heart pushes back. The heart argues that a life lived only by calculation is no life at all. To feel deeply, to love, to grieve, that is what makes us human. The most effectual means of being secure against pain, says the head, is to retire within ourselves. But the heart replies, and what more sublime delight than to mingle tears with one whom the hand of heaven hath smitten? In the end, Jefferson gives the final victory to the heart. It was the heart, he writes, not the head, that led America to revolution. When reason calculated the odds and found them wanting, it was passion that put our existence to the hazard, and we saved our country. It was during these years in Paris that another, more secret and consequential relationship began. After the death of one of his young daughters back in Virginia, Jefferson sent for his youngest, Polly, to join him. Accompanying her was a teenage enslaved girl named Sally Hemings. Sally was his late wife Martha's half-sister. She was about 14 years old, and by all accounts, beautiful. In Paris, a different set of rules applied. Under French law, Sally could have claimed her freedom. And as Jefferson prepared to return to America, she did something extraordinary. Pregnant with his child, she refused to go back with him to Virginia, where she would be re-enslaved. For perhaps the first time in his life, Jefferson was in a negotiation where he did not hold all the power. He, the master, had to bargain with her, the enslaved. According to the account of their son, Madison Hemings, Jefferson made her a solemn pledge: if she returned with him, he would free all of their children when they reached the age of 21. She agreed. It was a secret treaty, a private pact that would shape the rest of his life and cast a long shadow over his legacy. When Jefferson returned to America in 1789, he walked into a nation in the middle of a profound argument with itself. The new Constitution was in place, and George Washington was president. But two competing visions for the country's future were colliding. On one side was Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant and ambitious Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton believed in a strong central government, a powerful national bank, and an economy driven by manufacturing and finance, all modeled on the British system. He believed that the wealthy and well-born were the natural leaders of society and that the common people could not be trusted. At a dinner party, Jefferson recalled Hamilton declaring that the British government was the most perfect model of government that could be formed. When Jefferson pointed to portraits of his own heroes, the philosophers Bacon, Locke, and Newton, Hamilton paused, and then declared that the greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar. On the other side was Jefferson. As Washington's Secretary of State, he was horrified by what he saw. He believed Hamilton and his Federalist allies, whom he called monocrats, were betraying the spirit of the Revolution. He saw their financial system as a machine for corruption, designed to enrich speculators and tie the country's interests to Britain. He feared they were slowly, subtly steering America back toward monarchy. The two men were, as Jefferson later said, pitted against each other every day in the cabinet like two cocks in a pit. But Jefferson was a savvy politician. He knew he couldn't fight Hamilton head-on. So he worked behind the scenes. In one of the most famous compromises in American history, Jefferson hosted a dinner party with Hamilton and James Madison. Over wine, they struck a deal. Jefferson and Madison would allow Hamilton's controversial plan for the federal government to assume state debts to pass. In exchange, Hamilton would use his influence to ensure that the permanent national capital would be located on the Potomac River, a victory for the South. It was a classic Jeffersonian move, a quiet conversation, a pragmatic bargain, and a monumental outcome. He also led the opposition in a new way. He secretly sponsored a Republican newspaper, run by the poet Philip Freneau, to counter the pro-Hamilton press. He wrote letters, encouraged allies, and quietly built a political party from the ground up, all while publicly claiming to be above the fray. The fight for the soul of the Republic reached its peak during the presidency of John Adams. The nation was on the brink of war with France, and in a climate of fear and paranoia, the Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws gave the president sweeping new powers to deport foreigners and, most alarmingly, made it a crime to write, print, utter or publish anything false or malicious against the government. To Jefferson, this was tyranny. It was the final proof that the Federalists were determined to crush liberty. He called it a reign of witches. Republican newspaper editors were arrested. A congressman was jailed for criticizing the president. It was a dark time, and it set the stage for the epic presidential election of 1800. And so we return to where we began, that tense winter in Washington, with the nation holding its breath. The tie between Jefferson and Burr was not just a constitutional crisis, it was the climax of a decade-long battle over the future of America. The Federalists, in their last gasp of power, saw an opportunity. They could deny Jefferson the presidency by throwing their support to the more pliable Aaron Burr, or they could try to prevent an election altogether and appoint an interim president. For 35 ballots in the House of Representatives, the deadlock held. State delegations were tied. Men slept on cots in the Capitol. The country edged closer to chaos. But Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson's great rival, made a fateful choice. He despised Jefferson's politics, but he feared Burr even more. He saw Burr as an unprincipled man of dangerous ambition. Jefferson, Hamilton believed, for all his radical ideas, had a pretension to character. He was a man of principles, however flawed. To my mind, Hamilton wrote, Jefferson is by far not so dangerous a man. Hamilton used his influence to persuade a key Federalist to break the deadlock. On the 36th ballot, on February 17, 1801, Thomas Jefferson was elected the third President of the United States. It was what he called the Revolution of 1800. It was a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, something that had rarely happened in human history. In his inaugural address, he sought to heal the nation's wounds. "We have called by different names brethren of the same principle," he declared. "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." It was a masterstroke of political leadership, a call for unity after a decade of division. As president, Jefferson governed with a quiet but firm hand. He shocked his opponents not by tearing down the government, but by mastering it. His greatest triumph was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. When Napoleon, bogged down in Europe, offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory, a vast expanse of land that would double the size of the country, Jefferson faced a dilemma. The Constitution said nothing about the federal government having the power to acquire new territory. As a strict constructionist, he believed he had no authority to make the deal. But he was also a pragmatist. This was an opportunity that might never come again. It would secure the nation's western border and create what he called an empire of liberty for generations to come. So, he set aside his constitutional scruples. He did the deal. It was a stunning example of what Jon Meacham calls using Hamiltonian means to achieve Jeffersonian ends. He used the power of the central government in a way Hamilton could only have dreamed of, but he did it in the service of his vision of an agrarian republic. He immediately dispatched Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on their legendary expedition to explore the new territory and find a route to the Pacific. It was an act of scientific curiosity and geopolitical ambition, a perfect expression of the Jeffersonian mind. His second term, however, was far more difficult. With Britain and France locked in a death struggle, American shipping was caught in the crossfire. Desperate to avoid war, Jefferson pushed through the Embargo Act of 1807. It was a radical experiment. He shut down all American trade with the outside world, hoping that economic pressure would force Britain and France to respect American neutrality. It was a disaster. The embargo crippled the American economy, especially in New England, and did little to change British or French policy. It was a vast overreach of federal power, far exceeding the Alien and Sedition Acts he had so fiercely opposed. The man who believed in limited government was now policing every ship in every harbor. It was a painful lesson in the limits of power. After 8 years, Jefferson followed Washington's example and walked away from the presidency, retiring to his beloved Monticello. For the final 17 years of his life, he was the sage of Monticello, an American icon. He filled his days with his passions: architecture, farming, science, and his endless correspondence. He sold his magnificent library to the government after the British burned the Capitol in the War of 1812, forming the foundation of the modern Library of Congress. He devoted his last years to one final, great project: the founding of the University of Virginia. It was the culmination of his life's belief in the power of reason and education. He designed the campus, planned the curriculum, and recruited the faculty. It was, he said, to be an institution based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. In these final years, he also reconciled with his old friend and rival, John Adams. Their correspondence is one of the treasures of American history. They wrote about everything: philosophy, religion, history, their triumphs, their regrets, and their hopes for the nation they had helped create. "You and I ought not to die," Adams wrote, "before we have explained ourselves to each other." But even in retirement, Jefferson could not escape the great, unresolved contradiction of his life: slavery. He called it a hideous blot and a moral and political depravity. He knew it was wrong, and he feared it would one day tear the nation apart. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, which drew a geographical line between free and slave states, sounded to him like a fire bell in the night. The knell of the Union. "We have the wolf by the ear," he wrote, "and we can neither hold him, nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other." And so, the man who had declared that all men are created equal lived and died a master of more than 600 enslaved people. He made his private peace, keeping his promise to Sally Hemings and quietly freeing their children. But he failed to lead the nation toward a public solution. It was the great tragedy of his life, a failure of both his head and his heart. As he grew older, he kept his eye on the calendar. He wanted to live to see the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. As the day approached in the summer of 1826, he was weak and confined to his bed. In the final hours, his mind drifted back to the Revolution. "Warn the committee to be on the alert," he murmured. On the evening of July 3rd, he asked, "Is it the 4th? "Not yet," he was told. He held on through the night. On July 4, 1826, 50 years to the day after his words had given birth to a nation, Thomas Jefferson died. Hundreds of miles away, in Massachusetts, John Adams lay on his own deathbed. His last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." And in so many ways, he was right. Commentary. So what do we take away from this incredible life, this journey through the birth of a nation? Jon Meacham's great achievement in The Art of Power is showing us that Thomas Jefferson wasn't a marble statue. He wasn't a hypocrite, or a saint. He was a deeply human leader, full of contradictions, wrestling with the same essential conflict we all face: the gap between the world as it is, and the world as we wish it could be. The most powerful lesson for me is Jefferson's pragmatism. He was a man of soaring ideals, but he never let his idealism blind him to reality. He believed in a limited government, but when the opportunity arose to double the size of the nation with the Louisiana Purchase, he seized it, stretching the Constitution to its limits. He hated public speaking, so he mastered the written word. He feared monarchy, but he understood that to defeat it, he had to build a political party and fight for power, even if it meant getting his hands dirty. He teaches us that leadership isn't about purity, it's about effectiveness. It's about understanding that progress is often incremental, that you have to be contented to secure what we can get from time to time, and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. That's a profound insight, especially today, when it's so easy to get frustrated that the world doesn't immediately conform to our ideals. But Meacham also doesn't let Jefferson off the hook. His life is a powerful, and often tragic, reminder of our capacity for self-deception. The same man who could write with such breathtaking eloquence about liberty could own other human beings. He could father children with an enslaved woman and keep them in bondage for years, all while living in a world of his own design at Monticello. It's a stark lesson that our greatest strengths can exist alongside our most profound moral failures. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our heroes, and about ourselves. How do we reconcile the good with the bad? How do we judge historical figures who were trapped in the moral blind spots of their own time? I think the best way to start applying Jefferson's wisdom is to embrace his method. First, be a relentless learner. Jefferson's power came from his insatiable curiosity. He studied everything: architecture, science, farming, philosophy, not just for pleasure, but because he believed that knowledge was the raw material of power. So, today, ask yourself, what's one thing you're curious about that you can spend just 15 minutes learning? Pick up a book on a new topic. Watch a documentary. Start building your own library of ideas. Second, practice the art of quiet influence. Jefferson knew he couldn't win every argument with the force of his personality. So he built relationships. He hosted dinners. He wrote letters. He found common ground. Think about a disagreement you're having right now, big or small. Instead of trying to win the argument, try to understand the other person's perspective. Can you find a small point of agreement to build on? That was the Jeffersonian way. Finally, hold on to your core vision, but be flexible in your tactics. Jefferson's ultimate goal was the success of the American experiment in self-government. That was his North Star. But the path to get there was winding. He compromised. He adapted. He even contradicted himself. He understood that true leadership is about steering the ship, not just drawing the map. That was a summary of Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power by Jon Meacham. We've really only scratched the surface today. A summary is like looking at a photograph of a great mountain, but reading the book is like making the climb yourself. It's in the quiet moments of reading, when you're deep in a story about a dinner party in Paris or a tense cabinet meeting in Philadelphia, that the real insights emerge. This summary is just a starting point, a way for you to decide if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity, I can't recommend this book enough. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's about understanding the very DNA of American leadership, and discovering timeless lessons about power, ambition, and the human heart. The link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please take a moment to click that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that these deep dives are helpful, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration of another world-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.